Hello, very good day. We are very happy to be in this event within the framework of ICC Make Climate Action Everyone Business Forum. The topic that brings us together is very important today. We have 3 expert speakers on this topic. We will start with Martín Fraguillo, a founding member of GPS Argentina Network. There is a professor of agrobusiness and bioenergy of University of San Andrés and the EVA Institute. Martin, can you start?
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My presentation, which will be, as you just mentioned, in a way introductory, has to do with the link between capital cost, or weighted average capital cost, as it's called in the business environment, transition risk, and how that affects the investments to align with the Paris Accord in developing countries. So next, please. So I think it's always interesting to review what is climate change from this perspective. So first is the greatest challenge humanity has faced, the greatest capital relocation in history, and the greatest reconstruction of the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. So it's critical for actors within the economy to be able to take the adequate decisions in where or in what assets to invest, and most of all, to be able to determine where not to invest. Besides, climate change is also seen or defined as systemic financial risk, and this has been an excellent work of the TCFD. Going back a bit in order to the ideas we would like to share with you today into defining if climate change is a stock problem or a flow problem, defining flow as greenhouse gas emissions that, according to national inventories of the IPCC, are emitted by countries, or stock, which is the GHGs, or mainly CO2, that has been accumulated in the atmosphere. Next, please. So from a flow perspective, we can see that today China is by far the largest emitter, right? If we compare China's current emissions with the US, Europe, Japan, etc., it's very relevant, the amount of CO2 that's being emitted by this country alone. But let's look at this from the other perspective, which is not flows, but instead stocks. Next, please. So when we look at the stock of CO2 that has been accumulated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1850, we can see that China, plus all the other countries that are in the gray section above, add up to less than 30%. And instead, in this accumulation of CO2, of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are creating climate change, we see that the US, the European countries, and we can include in Europe, the UK, and Russia, and of course, including Japan as well, we see that those countries add up to around 70 or 70 more, a bit more, 70%. Next, please. This publication, this group of scientists, which I think is the best source for these type of data, has also, for the first time this year, published in this form. And we can see that if we add up the emissions, or we compare the emissions from the third world countries to the, this is accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, there is still a long time, many decades, before China even reaches the European countries or the US. Next, please. So in order to understand what is it that the Paris Accord mandates and how we can achieve that, and maybe you have all seen the slope drawn many times. The first one appeared in the IPCC 1.5 degree report in 2018, and this one here was developed by different working groups of ICC, of the International Chamber of Commerce, in association with the Climate Hub Exponential Roadmap. So this is a trajectory that different industries globally must comply. And as we all know, energy has to go to zero emissions by 2050, the same with industry, buildings, transport. The food sector will remain emitting, but will need to increase its output, its production enormously to comply with demand and with future demand coming from middle-class people. And at the same time, as we can see in the bottom green line, today, the way we manage nature-based resources or the natural ecosystems is a source of emissions, and we must transform that into a long-term carbon sink. And by doing that, we really need to change. So there's a huge challenge for our countries members of GPS, which are Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, because we have large ecosystems that in order to become that huge carbon sink the world demands, because if not, we will not remain within the 1.5-degree trajectory, then we need investments and support. So I would like you to follow me in seeing this as the map of investments we need to do in the future. Next, please. So if we think about that, the investments, during the last 2 years, we've been very interesting documents being published from all these sources. One of the key document from my perspective is the International Energy Agency Net Zero 2050 document. And from their point of view, the cumulative investments until 2050 is around $136 trillion. We can see that from the Glasgow Financial Alliance of Net Zero is 125, which is a organization of banks, funds, etc. But I would like us to follow in these few minutes that we have here to focus on the most optimistic, I think, document that was published just last year by McKinsey, who was also the developer of the GFANZ document in 2021. And from their perspective, by 2030, that is in 6 years from now, the world will need $81 trillion of investments to follow the 1.5 trajectory, and by 2050, 271 trillion, which is a huge amount of capital that needs to be invested. Next, please. So this is the total amount, 275, right? And divided by years. So next, please. But let's focus on a second on how this document believes that that capital will be allocated within the regions. And so the world in this document has been split up in 3 main regions. The first one is Russia, Ukraine, and other oil or fossil fuel producing countries, including Middle East and Northern Africa. And if you see the square on the right that I put on this document, the per capita investment that they presume is going to be $54,000 per capita until 2050. If we go to the bottom, it's Europe, the US, China, et cetera, and Japan. And we see that from their perspective, it's going to be, the investments will add up to $65,000 per capita until 2025. But if we go to the middle, that's us, right? It's India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the rest of Asia. The presumed capital needs are only $14,000. And I think that demands, because I cannot believe that the necessary investments that we need to do, we will need less capital, maybe 1/4 compared to the other countries. So my question is, if we have capital costs that are higher than the other countries, many of which, or in many cases, that capital cost is aligned with the legislation and other compliance mandates that we're receiving, then how is it that we'll need to do this? So I think it's interesting from our public sector and private sector to work with these institutions to clearly understand that if with that level of capital investments, it will be enough. Next, please. Are we okay with time? So as we were just mentioning, capital cost is the critical element today when thinking about investing in the Paris Accord trajectory, right? And I think it's interesting, this concept that came from this group of young economists, that is the climate trap. And unfortunately, if we go to box number 1, developing countries or countries with different infrastructure or economic problems are receiving an impact from climate change that creates a situation of instability, low production, unemployment, and many other elements. Unfortunately, this leads to an increase in risks, not only domestic risk, not only the physical risk that comes with climate change, but also the transition risk of trying to be able to cope with that. And this leads into a weak domestic financial market, but also when open to the international financial system, also they get not the best of the situation. So this brings an higher insurance cost, which increases capital costs for these investments, right? And so unfortunately, what this drives to is to lower investments in low carbon technologies. And that's why I think we really need to work between public, private, multilateral sectors in order to understand it. Yes, please. Thanks. Next. So just to focus again on one basic concept that I'm sure everyone knows is what are climate-related financial risks? And it's clear from an investment perspective, financial markets must price risks, because if not, capital allocation decisions will be mistaken. So we need this transition to a lower carbon economy with legal, policy, technology, and market changes that are happening. But we need them to be reliable, and we need them to be aligned with how those better investments will be done, and not by banning, not by excluding sectors that could be doing a great benefit and not doing. So in order just for definition purposes, transition risks is divided as policy and legal risk. When we see the international arena today, the global trade or multilateral trading system, we see many elements that I'm sure Ambassador Acevedo will be mentioning just in a minute, related to policy and legal, new elements that are making things more difficult, and that's directly impacting in capital cost and in investments in this trajectory. Of course, the same is affecting the operation of different businesses and the trading system, and the other are not that relevant. So next, please. So when we look at this vision, right, from the other angle, right, that is not the financial system, that the real economy and the goods that are being exported and produced for international markets, we see things like the CBAM, which sounds like fine, but it's a tax that a product that will enter a certain region will have to pay if its emissions are exceeding a certain limit. But what happens if that product has emissions that are below that limit? The CBAM does not allow for payment for that. So is it fair, right? It's not, evidently, and that's not the spirit of the Paris Accord when creating Article 6 and many other elements to support finance, not to create trade barriers for a strong, very powerful region, simply to capture the benefits that others have invested and not allow them to monetize that. The same we're seeing with subsidies, direct payments, bans on imports, for example, from deforestation in areas that are illegal, and maybe they are legal because they're combating a weed or an invasive species, etc., etc. So, well, costs in different areas are increasing, and unfortunately, resources are extremely scarce when dedicated to positive externalities. Next, please. So just to wrap up, I would like to make in this minute that I have left a very simplified example of a world that has an X number of capital units to invest in this transition of the 1.5-degree trajectory, and one simple technology. Let's think for this purpose that are windmills, right? Wind generators, and two countries, right? Country A has subsidies, carbon border tax, of course, not paying for the positive externalities, etc., etc. And so internally, if you invest there, you have a low weighted average capital cost. And if you put windmills, the factor of generation is 1. If you look at country B, right, well, they have no subsidies. They have very high taxes on all sectors of the economy, including those related to climate change. When they export their goods, right, they have to pay that carbon border tax. But if their good is below the thresholds of emissions, they don't get any monetary payment for that. And when you look at that windmill, you just need 1/3 to generate the same amount of energy or to substitute the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions that were emitted. But in this case, we find that the weighted average capital cost for these type of technologies is much higher, right? So investors will prefer country A because it's much cheaper, much safer, but unfortunately, the same amount of capital will just generate just 1/3 of the climate solution, right? So I think this is something that we must have a reflection on. I'm hearing a few economies globally starting to discuss it. So I think the final question is, okay, are trade barriers based on climate change that increase transition risk and capital cost an efficient method to comply with the Paris Accord? So thank you very much. Thanks. You're on mute, Maria.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Martin. Many questions are right, but if you like, we continue with the presentations and leave the question for the final exchange. We continue with Roberto Acevedo, founding members of IBI. Roberto, if you want to continue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you all. If you let me go right ahead, and following the next slide, there is a slide, the next one. Yeah. So these are the points that I intend to touch upon, and I'm not going to go over that now. I'll do it as we go along. So let's move on to the next one, which talks about the intrinsic relationship between trade and sustainable development. And I would start basically by saying that, you know, trade, sustainable development, ESG values, they're all very important ingredients to our transition to a greener economy. But it's important that we know that this is more than just a goal. This is a reality. And we must ensure that this correlation leads to the best outcomes possible. And, you know, when countries undertook their NDGs back in Paris, I think everybody knew that those goals were not going to be achieved spontaneously. It's not that everybody all of a sudden decided, okay, this is the right thing to do. And then businesses are going to start investing with the right technologies and practices, etc., because these things cost money, and they're going to be look at the competition as well. So of course, governments knew that they had to step in and provide incentives and deterrents so that companies would take action. Now, this environment, of course, is much more, constrains a lot more the companies, but they also offer opportunities for everyone that is ahead of the curve, that is thinking ahead and preparing for the regulations that are going to come. And few sectors actually are in a position to be carbon neutral, and some can also be carbon negative in the sense that they can sequestrate carbon from the atmosphere. And agro-industry is obviously one sector that can do that due to its potential contribution to sustainability goals. It is pioneering in innovation, good practices. So with the proper stimulus, agribusiness can be an even greater positive multiplier to the national economy and to the global climate efforts. So when we say that and we look ahead, we have some pretty important challenges ahead of us. One of them is unilateral measures, right? Because these unilateral measures are creating a disruptive environment, and they upset the playing field. And I'll get into that in a little while. The second thing is that while this is obvious for trade-related measures, it's not so obvious in other ones. But it is clear that this is also happening, these unilateral measures are also happening in other ESG items. For example, when companies are subject to the duty of due diligence in matters of human rights and the environment, which is extremely important, by the way. So we have the human rights and environmental due diligence, HREDD, which countries are following. So in the next slide, there are just a few examples of those types of measures. So you have there in the UK, in France, in the Netherlands, Germany, in the European Union, all those acts that are listed there, they try to address issues of, labor rights that affect the business operations, not only in headquarters and in the immediate subsidiaries, but also in their global supply chains. And of course, there are major extraterritorial implications with all of those measures. But while that happens in this space, if you look at trade, and that is the next slide, this is so much more obvious. And there you have only two examples, and these are really just examples. They're both in the EU, but it's not only there. So a recent example is the IRA in the US. The IRA provides a number of incentives for companies to transition to the green economy, which is a great thing, by the way. But at the same time, it does introduce a number of distortions. And those distortions, in general, because they come in the shape of incentives, they provide an advantage to American companies that are operating globally and even in the US market. So, of course, other companies feel that they are being shortchanged, and that the US is providing an undue advantage to the American companies. These two examples that you have there on the slide, they are the opposite. They are not providing incentives. They are punishing, at the end of the day, companies that are emitting carbon. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, which was published in May 2023, it's a clear and very obvious example. It targets products that are energy intensive to begin with, and those are, for example, cement, steel and iron, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. And what it does is, because it is punishing the production of those goods in European territory, so those companies become less competitive compared to their peers outside the EU. The solution that was found is, all right, so what we're going to do is, to maintain that kind of competitiveness, we're going to apply extra duties to the products, to those products that are imported from other countries, where the environmental standards are substandard compared to European standards, of course. And the impact of this in countries like Brazil, for example, and these are numbers that came from Fiesp, the São Paulo Federation of Industries. In the case of Brazil, 15% of Brazilian exports in 2022 went to the EU, and 4%, $2.1 billion with iron and steel. So the challenges here is that, of course, the scope of CBAM may expand. So these sectors and these products that we mentioned just now, they are just the beginning. They could include other products down the road. And the other problem we have is that other countries may emulate or even retaliate, adopting measures of their own. The same goes, or similarly, it goes for the published deforestation regulation that the EU published in June 2023, this year, and it aims to reinforce measures to combat deforestation elsewhere. And the impact that it has is on approximately 34% of Brazil's total exports to the 27 EU member countries. And this represents about 17.5 billion in business in 2022. Well, that's a lot of money. And the challenges here, of course, is the tracking measures, right? So you're going to be tracking the origin of each product that is exported to the EU, and there are a number of target products that are selected to begin with. And of course, another challenge is yield protectionism. And at the end of the day, arbitrary standards. What is something that in Brazil means deforestation or reforestation or something like that in the EU is not the same thing. So those standards are not fully aligned. So if we go to the next slide, what I would like to point out is that these unilateral measures, despite the fact that they are taken with good intentions, right? They want to promote the transition to the green economy somehow, punishing or providing incentives to companies. But despite those intentions, these unilateral measures are a threat to the global sustainability and climate goals. And why is that? Because they, number one, they provoke unilateral responses by others. So other countries that are affected, they're not going to sit idle, they're going to respond somehow with measures of their own. Number two, because there are no clear international guidelines as far as trade is concerned that are directed or they are supposed to cover policies that affect the environment or they affect climate change efforts. We only have Article 20, and Article 20 in the WTO essentially, and you have the text down in the slide, it essentially in item B, it says that you can take measures that are necessary to protect human, animal, and plant life or health. So very general language. And the second one, it is that you can take measures which relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Again, very general in nature. So this vagueness, these rules, don't forget, they were negotiated all the way back to the 1940s in the case of the GATT. In the case of the WTO, the Uruguay round was in the 1980s. Nobody was talking about climate or environment. And I checked, the WTO agreements don't mention climate to begin with. There is no mention to climate whatsoever. And in the whole introduction, there is, I think, one mention to environment, one. And that's it. So we clearly lack an international framework to handle these things. Now, consequences of this unilateralism, I think, is the lack of international coordination, right? Which leads to a potentially arbitrary, discriminatory, and protectionist framework being adopted internationally. The second thing, another consequence, is the fragmentation of the regulatory environment, where regulations may even be incompatible with each other. I faced already a few complaints by companies that are saying, if I follow these standards, I can export to countries A, B, and C. But because I follow those standards, I cannot export to countries C, D, and E. So this is absolutely crazy. And we have to take care of that. We have to address this. Another consequence, of course, is the allergic reaction by the affected countries. Every unilateral measure faces response somewhere else. And finally, it ends up slowing the transition to the green economy, not accelerating the transition to the green economy. You may accelerate in your territory, nationally, but one country or one region is not going to do the trick. You need everybody to be working in the same direction at the same time. So if we go unilateral, we will end up slowing the transition to the green economy, not accelerating the transition to the green economy. So if we move to the next slide, this is a call, I think, for the need for true and effective multilateralism. Because with rising temperatures, the agricultural sector is already facing significant challenges. Right? This is already a reality. According to a recent study published in the Journal of Nature Climate Change, approximately 28% of all the agricultural areas in the Brazil Center-West, which is the main seller of Brazil, they are no longer in the ideal climate pattern for planting soybeans and corn. All right, so this is already there. And if things continue to go this way, this number will reach 50% by 2030 and 74% by 2060. So on the other hand, the agribusiness has a great opportunity to contribute positively, you know, to curbing the effects of climate change. They are adopting sustainable practices. They are introducing technological innovations. And this is one of the few sectors where you can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. But to do that, so that the sector contributes the way it could and it should, this requires adequate national regulations, because if you don't have national regulations that promote this change, this is not going to happen. But it also needs immediate global cooperation based on true and effective multilateralism. So let's go to the next.
You have 2 minutes.
Yep. So global stocktake, what I would like to point out is the global stocktake, we don't want it to end up legitimizing the current policymaking mindset, which is based on unilateralism. I don't think that's something that is going to help. What we need is the GST to support climate multilateralism, and at the same time, encourage and acknowledge the actions that are taken by those that are striving to adapt and transform their productive systems. And this is happening a lot in the developing countries, and those efforts are not being acknowledged. And the next slide, please. So a few things, guidelines that I think we should promote with the global stocktake. The first one is to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, that each country will have its own needs, and the policies that are required for each country are different from the others. We should not be reinforcing unilateralism. We should recognize the enormous potential to increase agricultural areas by means of recovering degraded land. This is not the case today, and we need to acknowledge that. And the GST should not be prioritizing certain productive practices or systems over others that can also contribute in the same way. All methods and technologies that lead to sustainable, productive, and low carbon production should be encouraged, and they differ from region to region, from country to country. If we follow these guidelines, we should be fine. The next slide is just a call to show that developing countries in general are the ones that are that contribute less to climate change, but at the same time, to the extent that they are the ones paying for the unilateral measures that are being introduced, you're turning the principle of the differentiated responsibilities on its head. It's the opposite now. It's the developing countries, which are the ones who emit less, that are now asked to pay more for the larger costs of carbon mitigation. And this is a huge change in the nature and the culture of what we are trying to achieve here. So the last slide that I want to point to you and to conclude my presentation is essentially to say that countries like Brazil and many others, they are serious about this. They're taking action. In Brazil, they have the ABC Plus plan. They have the RenovaBio. I mean, there are a number of measures that are being taken. They need to be acknowledged. They need to be recognized, and they need to count somehow. And once again, the way forward is true and effective multilateralism. I'm not saying that we all have to agree on everything, but a clear, coordinated discussion internationally is needed at this point in time. Otherwise, we're going to get worse. We're not going to get better. So that's my conclusion and my call for action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I have a lot of questions, but we continue. The green transition challenges the green transition challenges economic science, regulation, and business in general. We have a lot to study to understand about this new world that we must deal with. We continue and we finish with Diego Flaiban, Director of Operation with Financial Intermediates at BIT Investment in the South Con. Diego, if you want to start.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for the invitation. Well, there are things that we have to do, things that we cannot change. So basically, I'm going to talk about what the financial sector is doing in terms of sustainability and how we are tackling climate risk and transition risk. Next, please. The big group has a public sector side dealing with governments. This is helping governments design policies, which is important in the thing that we are talking about today. I live in Best, where I'm working, do the same with private sector, basically working with corporates, infrastructure, financial intermediaries in moving the sustainability agenda. And we also have IDB Lab, which is basically dealing with innovation and working with all the ecosystem in Latin America. Next, please. Well, obviously the world is in transformation. We all know that, but what is the financial sector doing, right? In the next slide, we can see that 30 plus years ago, banks in the region were only trying to avoid doing no harm to the environment, right? So basically, in the inclusion of exclusion lists are something that they was broadly used. Then we moved to incorporate environmental and social risks. That was like 20 plus years ago. Banks in Latin America start incorporating environmental and social, identifying those risks, how to manage and mitigate them. And I would say that there's a shifting point, maybe the Paris Accord in 2015, in which banks or the financial industry started seeing this as a purpose creation, creating value, how we can impact in terms of social and environmental, how we can contribute to the SDGs, moving the agenda on that side. Latin America is not behind that focus. Next one, please. But obviously, this comes with a change in paradigm. Basically, companies 50 years ago were trying to maximize shareholder profit. Now we're trying to create value to the stakeholders. How we can work with the society in which we operate. How we can help our clients, employees. It's a broader approach to sustainability. Financial sector is not behind that. So basically, we have the principles for responsible investment, 325 signatories, 50% of global assets are signing these principles, 52 of Latin America. 2 years ago, we have seen in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which have been now signed by 138 banks. And this is a challenge, basically. And 138 banks commit to 2030, 2050, reduce to zero the emissions of the portfolio they invest, basically their clients. It's representing 41% of global assets. 15 banks in Latin America are following these standards, which is a big portion still growing, which shows the commitment of the region as well. I will also to mention IGMA principles for thematic bond issuances. IGMA is International Capital Markets Association, basically a few years ago, started developing the guidelines for thematic bond issuances, green, social, sustainable, sustainability-linked bonds, etc. Talk a little bit more later. And obviously, another shift in paradigm is the investor demographic changes. Basically, investors are now moving from traditional lending, conventional lending, to incorporating ESG strategies and going forward to that, trying to do impact investing, how we can measure the impact we do with our lending. And that comes with the demographic changes. Millennials, 84% wanted to invest or invest in following ESG strategies. Those millennials now in charge of many funds around the world, designing strategies for investment. So this is something that's coming. Regulation is there, but the companies, the financial industry, investors are doing its shares to keep the pace. Next one, please. Latin America also has seen an evolution, scaling up sustainable investment. 2015 again being, if you want, the cornerstone for this scaling. This is how the financial industry, banks specifically around Latin America, are working together in roundtables, protocol, how in trying to define taxonomies, how trying to define how we incorporate climate risk, transition risk, environmental and social risk into their agendas, how we can harmonize the requirements of Europe, the United States, and other regions to Latin America, having a voice, 24 initiatives around Latin America, 16 countries. Multilaterals have a lot to do with this, trying to work with financial institutions. They see a risk, they see an opportunity, a business opportunity out of this, and they see a regulatory changes that we have been talking about. Next one, please. Next. Basically, I've been working with financial industry for 25 more plus years, and I'm advocate of financial intermediaries being a sustainable enabler to the economy. I mean, I think that the more important add to sustainable development goals of sustainable development finance obviously is trying to reduce the financing gap, and financial intermediaries can move the need funding for this purpose. Next one, please. Again, when I was talking about 20 years ago, we were working with banks. Now it's something that is well brought along the industry. Environmental and social risk management has been incorporated for the last 20 years in the risk profile, in the risk analysis of banks. Environmental social, but this is an agenda that is moving. Now we have facing climate risk. Us as IDB Invest are investing only in clients which takes into account climate transition physical risk. Basically, we want them to align to Paris. And that for banks is a challenge, basically, right? So have to adapt what they have been doing for 20 plus years, you know, when Ecuadorian principles, following IFC performance standards, and how to incorporate the new risk in the portfolio, which happens to be important to address the overall risk of the bank. Transition risk, you know, how companies are driving to a low carbon economy, our low carbon processes, the physical risk specifically in many of our countries, which, you know, many of our banks that are concentrating in agribusiness sector, how climate change is going to affect our clients, that's going to affect repayment of our loans. The long term, we are talking about mitigation, but adaptation is a key issue here. How our clients are adapting to infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure adaptation of cities, infrastructure, the adaptation of the agri sector as well. How we can adapt to the things that are unavoidable, because I mean, we know that climate change, some issues are going to stay forever, so we have to tackle it down now. And that's something that still need to be addressed in terms of financing. Next one, please. And the evolution has been steady for the, I mean, again, 20 years ago, banks along Latin America didn't have anything. They start working on environmental social management systems to address environmental risks. Then they start moving to analyze the investment in green and social, with a green and social focus, creating portfolios, then moving into the signing of pre-net zero, moving towards transparency through TCFD, issuing debt, thematic bonds. Now we have like 15 of those banks where those are signatories of net zero are in the right side of the slide, more like climate and social champs. A few of them are still in the basic, many of niche banks, retail banks, but most of them are intermediate and advanced. They know that the environment is changing. I mean, people are asking for more more conscious investments. They have to validate their license to operate. There is a scrutiny of banks have to validate every day. So they are doing a lot of things to, attract investors, to attract business. I think that the pressures are there. The challenge that we face right now is trying to fund it in a way, right? So next one, please. That's why we cannot talk about financial sector if we don't talk about capital market, which I think is going to be key to develop and finance most of the projects that are related to transition, that are related to climate change, that are related to transition to a lower economy. That's why I think it's important to mention that we don't need to find projects. Projects are there. The problem is how we finance and how we create financial products that are ready to be funded by investors. Investors that are, many of them are within the region, but we have to attract also investment outside the region, right? In creating the proper financial products, we can attract them. Basically, this is a good example. Thematic bonds, you know what thematic bonds basically, an issuer issue a bond with a use of proceeds that's earmarked for a green project or a social project. Has been a lot of sustainability linked bonds, basically, in which issuers commit to comply with a key performance indicator. For example, reduction in GHG emission reduction along the way, transition bonds for those highly polluters, steel, cement, etc. Also emitting bonds in order to invest, to fund its investments. Next one, please. As I told you before, I mean, this is a problem. We need more money flowing to Latin America. We have seen the capital markets that are not well developed in the region, but for a few cases like Brazil, Mexico, maybe Colombia. But the problem is that we are lagging behind other regions, other development regions like Asia and Eastern Europe. Most issuance, international issuance I'm speaking about, are sovereign. We need to work more on the corporate side. We need to work more on the SME side, and that's how our public policy should work on trying to develop these capital markets in order to money to flow to the region and to these specific projects. Next one, please. And we have been seeing a speed up, a scale in thematic bond issuances, led obviously also by governments, but also by financial institutions. We have seen a steep decline. You will see in 2022, 2023, there's a reduction in the issuances. That is because higher interest rates, which tends me to think if increased costs, as Martin was saying, will be a barrier to developing investments in climate change, because of we are seeing that increased cost is affecting financing of these projects, and we see this in how the international capital markets are being affected by high interest rates. Next one, please. But the good thing that this is picking up. Companies are seeing this as an opportunity, and seeing this as will be something that can prevent us to access new markets. So they are doing its share. They are doing its investments. We have financed since 2018 37 label bonds, thematic bonds, a lot of them green, a lot of innovation in every sector, in the blue economy, in the circular economy. We did a lot of social bonds, basically trying to read SMEs, trying to read financial inclusion to certain populations. Sustainability, we have seen a lot of sustainability-linked bonds, companies trying to issue debt, and the commitment is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we are seeing how the industry is moving, how there's an appetite for this kind. At the beginning, these were 100% subscribed by IDB Invest. Now we are anchor investors, attracting capital. There's a lot of capital out there. The things that we are seeing is there's a lot of projects as well. The thing that we are seeing, the proper instruments are not here, because in the past we have been channeling concessional financing, but we are not. We cannot do the 9.5. I don't know how Martin said the figure was enormous. The figure that we need to achieve the sustainable development goals. We need the financial markets to move. We need the banks to start catalyzing local savings and international funds for these projects. And obviously, we need the help of the developed countries, and obviously the financial intermediaries or multilaterals like us who can be a good channel of those funds. Actually, we are trying to mobilize more than what the money we're putting in projects. That's our main goal. Next one, please. And last but not least, knowledge dissemination, knowledge creation. This is an example. I think that's another barrier for this to grow in companies, is the lack of the knowledge, the lack of capacity. This is something that we have to work with governments, try to not only through public policies, but also trying to work with corporates to SMEs in disseminating good practices, how specifically in the agri sector, how we can approach traceability, how we can approach good practices in terms of food production. There's a lot of things that we are doing right now, and we are seeing a lot of demand out of this. And I'm better optimistic in which we can achieve most of the development challenges by helping them, by having the help of multilaterals, having the help of the government as well. But you know, it's something that we have to work hard on getting to there. I think that's all. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Diego. We have 10 more minutes to talk and to ask some questions. Maybe I can start if you want. I have a lot of questions to do, but the first one that I want to ask you is if the global financial system and some countries are forcing companies to analyze and report the climate risk from the financial institution, do you find capacity in the organizations and companies of the region to be able to face this requirement? Maybe Martin, Diego, Roberto, and you speak about this.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a volunteer from Diego or Roberto, but briefly, what we're finding at Carbon Group that from a physical risk perspective, yes, there is the capacity. From a transition risk perspective, specifically from the legal aspects of countries, since, as Roberto was mentioning, there are so many new regulations and laws and things being implemented all the time that no, we're not finding any capacity, even in the largest companies in the highest level countries.
To add what Martin was saying, obviously big corporations, international corporations that are along the international value chains has more knowledge than SMEs. I want to address that as well, because SMEs in the region have a lack of capacity. When we talk about small and medium agricultural producers, specifically how we can, this is expensive to get certifications that are going to need. So there's a problem there. Maybe a big company can pay for a certification, but a medium size will be, to maintain a certification, to pay for that, it's going to be expensive. So capacity, sometimes they don't know what to do. You know, they have, you know, agricultural techniques are old. How we can adapt them to the new realities of climate change. There's technology going out there that can help, but we don't even have, you know, 5G or 4G connectivity. So there's a lot of barriers that, although they can understand how it works, I mean, can prevent for the further development or improvement or reducing this risk. I have to make that change, that differentiation between SMEs and big corporations as well.
Yeah, I agree. Look, at the end of the day, this transition is only going to happen if the efforts, if the investments make sense economically. That's as simple as that. Companies are not going to be worse off economically by making those investments. So either we find a way of financing that investment, and in the long run, if the investment is made, it makes sense for the company, right? But they need help to make those investments. There are, in agriculture, for example, I know that because I have visited them, you know, on the ground. And often they say, look, the transition to regenerative agriculture is fantastic, but it's only going to pay off 3, 4, 5 years from now. When it does pay off, it pays off big time. And I want to do that, but I don't have the money to do it. So the producer needs some kind of incentive. Somebody has to bridge the gaps, whether this is going to be done by governments, whether this is going to be done by banks themselves, because this is good business at the end of the day, whether this is going to be done by international financial institutions, that's something we have to figure out. But it's a win-win proposition, but we need someone to step in.
One thing that is important is the construction of public goods. That is a step very important in this way. I have another question. How could multilateral credit institutions collaborate to prevent climate goals for being the gateway to increase transition risk and the consequent restrictions of investment in less developed countries?
Well, maybe that's for, I mean, in terms of multilateral banks, we have, our goal is to channel investments through the region. That's our main goal, how we can, and you have what we call a seal of quality. Usually when we work with a client, we address all the risks and trying to improve all the risks. And you don't have to comply from one day to the other. It's a roadmap to compliance. So the capacity building, technical advisory, that is what we do in order to get to compliance in the long term. So it's impossible to do it from one day to the other. So our goal is try to help banks. And then from our public sector side, working with governments, trying to build the public policies that can help this and trying to get to a roadmap for implementation of certain risks that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what Diego said. He's the expert here, so I subscribe. You're on mute.
Oh, excuse me. For finish, I ask you for any comment you would like to share to finish, but maybe you can say something about what are the main difficulties in advancing in the sustainable and economically viable green transition.
Yeah, well, let me just say a few things to conclude then. I think, number one, this is a process. This is not going to be concluded in the near term. And I don't think that companies or governments can wait or have the luxury of waiting to see where things end up. They need to take action right away. And for companies, this is a really difficult situation because there is a lot of unpredictability out there. They need clarity, they need predictability, they need to know where the governments are going to go, what the rules are. And those need to be set up very clearly by governments. They have to be talking to their private sectors. They have to be seeking win-win scenarios because bankrupting businesses is not the solution. Then you have unemployment, then you have scarcity of supply, particularly food. The last thing you want is to bankrupt your food producer. So that is something you don't want to do. So that kind of dialogue and conversation within the national structure is extremely important. But more than that, transborder conversation is also important. Internationally discussing these things. Measures like CBAM or IRA, and they will have tremendous impact internationally. And you cannot just assume that everybody else is going to be happy and just figure it out. No, I think people will have to have a conversation about how are these measures going to be implemented? How are you going to calculate the carbon footprint of products coming from different regions in the same country? So there is a lot to talk about, and I think we cannot afford to wait. So governments need to take the initiative to find a dialogue, to find a forum for this kind of conversation, whichever that forum is.
Thank you very much.
Diego, go ahead.
No, I mean, again, to sum up, we need, again, capacity building, creating products that can be ready for investors to invest in. Companies are there with the projects. But I agree with Roberto that obviously public sector should do its share. We are just starting with taxonomies in Central and Latin American countries, working with taxonomies. I mean, after how many years of the EU working with those? I mean, but we are working alone. We are not working as a region. We are not speaking up as a region. So we need to convene somehow in trying to reconcile whatever European Union is doing, how we can reconcile to our standards, to our needs, to our reality, which is different along Latin America, Caribbean, Central America is not the same as Southern Corn. But still, we need to speak up as a region in order to get to certain agreements.
No, impeccable. No, I really enjoyed and liked what Roberto and Diego mentioned. And I would like to make a comment from the ICC perspective and GPS, and from the private sector and private sector organizations, what in the COP language is called are called the bingos, right? The business and industries, NGO. And I think the world needs that these type of organizations, those that gather the private sector, have a very serious and responsible conversation with the different governments, so that each one of those SMEs or large multinational are being led into the right path to comply with this trajectory, and to try to avoid these high capital costs and all the other consequences that we've been mentioning. But I would like to enhance the importance of these institutions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are finishing now. Well, see you in another opportunity.